I just wanted to say that this is, in a sense, for investigative journalists, a kind of a normal meeting, because the man who's sitting to my right is probably the best known investigative reporter, certainly in the English language world, who's done more of what we think of as journalism, of proper journalism, than almost anybody we can think of. Seymour Hersh, for the few of you, and there may be only one or two of you who don't know some of this, but is responsible for My Lai, the story of My Lai and the cover-up of My Lai, for an extraordinary history of Mr. Kissinger, the dark Camelot book on the Kennedy family, which is in itself an extremely interesting book. I'd recommend it to anyone. He's also done probably the most important work on torture in current US government practice in his work on Abu Ghraib. A story which I hope he'll tell us about in some detail, because what's extraordinary about the Abu Ghraib story is that so many other people appeared to have parts of it or some of it and didn't publish it. It was, in fact, a movie was just made about a kind of religious paean to Dan Rather, which was just made, in which a woman comes rushing up to the main character playing Dan Rather and says, "I think Seymour Hersh has got this story first," or something to this effect. So this was a motivating factor in this scene. But most of you know, an overwhelming majority of you know who Seymour Hersh is, and I'll introduce Seymour Hersh.
All right.
Since I told Gavin it probably made sense for him to ask me some questions that are more locally relevant, because I just have my own objective view of America. We are a very exceptional country. We're going to see Hillary versus Trump. That's exceptionalism. But I'll tell you, the whole purpose of journalism, the way I look at it is there's a narrative and there's a counter-narrative. And so I always think about the counter-narrative. In this election, I would say one of the counter-narratives, of course, Sanders is a counter-narrative, but not only because he's coming from the point of view that the system is so corrupt, and what he's talking about is we're actually seeing played out. Some of you probably know, if you check the email, there was a riot last night where Trump finally spoke in the north in Illinois, and of course a couple of thousand people rioted there, and they had to shut down the speech, which is going to happen. I don't know where America's going to go, but he's describing a real situation. There's a polarization in America that's unavoidable at this point between, if you will, the Christian right or the right and the rest of us. For me, the interesting thing about Sanders, of course, just in terms of how do you think about a story like this, I think about it this way. Although Sanders is Jewish, he's very open-minded about the need for the rights of the Palestinians, very sensitive to the way the Israelis treat them, the Palestinian community, and that 50 or 60 years of grinding their nose in terms of humility into the dust. And so for me, the Sanders thing is this. The first time in my lifetime, I actually am seeing a Democrat running for the presidency who doesn't have to go to the Jewish community in New York for money. That offers incredible possibilities. It's just so interesting to me. But of course, for the media, it's a non-entity. So it's always finding things, it's always looking at things from a different point of view. And he mentioned Abu Ghraib. I knew about Abu Ghraib for, 5.5 months before I could finally get enough to write about it. In America, it's very hard. You have to have what made Snowden work so well, although please don't. I'm not suggesting anything but great things about what he did, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But a lot of us knew that we were being watched. We knew that metadata was going on. We didn't know how bad it was, and we knew it was extensive. I was told right after 9/11, I haven't put any interview notes in my computer ever since. I was told by somebody not to do it in October of a month after 9/11, so I knew then something was up, although it was hard to figure it all out. But if you think about Snowden, here's what you think about when people talk about paranoia. So let's see. The NSA, I did a story about the NSA in 1999 for the New Yorker. And by the way, you're talking to somebody, as you heard all those wonderful things about what a good career I had. I've worked at 3 places in my career: the AP, Associated Press, the New York Times for many years, talk about establishment press, and at the New Yorker. And each place I've left, and everybody cheered. So happy to get rid of me. Nobody said, "Oh, please." Nobody said, "Oh, please come back." No. So I understand the limits to the game. The thing that's interesting about this, the same in Abu Ghraib, the same idea that you know something, and how can you get it out? What do you need to do to get it out, get it into the mainstream? It's very hard. Documents are important. And Snowden is important because he released documents, and that's what makes Julian so important. I use his stuff. I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. There's great indexes. You can write. I was just writing something about Syria. We can talk about that in a minute. And there's so much stuff there. Even if it's not highly classified, historians are going to have an incredibly good time with the 500,000 various documents or more he's put out. In any case, about Snowden, the way I look at the Snowden story is I say, okay, let's see. We now know, I started to tell you that in 1999, I spent time writing about the NSA because I knew how it was just sort of comically. A friend of mine in the CIA once asked somebody in the late 90s, this is when fiber optics were beginning to get going, and the NSA was really blind for a long time. I have a friend in the CIA. He's one of these extremely conservative but totally honest guys. And I once, after 9/11, this is a digression, remind me, somebody keep track of where I am so I get back to it. But I did, I was just thinking about him. I asked him once, after 9/11, I know before 9/11, nobody shared anything in the community. The NSA kept the stuff, the CIA kept the stuff, the FBI did. And some months after, there was some, without getting into, I'm still writing stuff about the post 9/11 period. But I had written for the New York Times a long article about domestic spying. And son of a bitch, but after 9/11, the CIA was back spying again inside America without telling the FBI. And of course, there were some events that I know about. And I went to one of my friends, this particular friend in the CIA, and I said, I really was mad at him. I said, geez, 9/11, that's sort of a traumatic event for us. And in real time it was. We were very vulnerable to this attack, obviously. And why were we so vulnerable? One of the reasons we were so vulnerable is everybody collected, nobody shared. And a few months after 9/11, we had some drinks, and I said to him, what is wrong with you guys in the CIA? What the hell is wrong with you? What kind of crazy people are you? You don't share anything, even now. And he looked at me and he said, hey, Cy, and I'd been doing stuff on the intelligence committee for a long time, was never put quite as clearly. He says, don't you get it? He said, the FBI catches bank robbers, and we rob banks. What do you think we do? And so every time I see the CIA, just the other day, they put out, I did stuff on bin Laden, challenging the official view, and the other day they called in reporters by name to a briefing, unnamed CIA official. The CIA has now become, I probably always has, but it's more clear now than ever. It's just another political office of the White House. There's no objectivity's disappeared. But anyway, they called him in and they released a series of bin Laden letters that were very interesting, saying how we're great friends, we Sunnis with the Shia in Iran, et cetera, all these crazy things. And they released all these letters that they claimed that the American SEALs who killed him, murdered him, because that's what it was, collected. And of course, the people there, nobody would ask this question. Let's see, no, it's very clear he was handwriting these stuff. They had said that. There was handwritten letters. And nobody said, well, wait a second. Is there a South Asian tradition to always keep a second copy of every letter you write? How do they get letters you're sending to other people? I mean, it's obvious. It's all, the line that goes on is breathtaking. And the naivety of the press remains breathtaking. To get back to the Abu Ghraib, well, about Snowden. Here's the thing that you have to know about Snowden. I had written about the incompetence of the CIA, of the NSA, of the inability in the late 90s to do much with fiber optics initially. They fixed it. And I'd gotten to it because a friend of mine, I once asked a friend, who was a station chief in the Middle East, what's the one thing he wanted the most? He said, oh my God, I wanted Ahmed with a good backhoe. I want him. And I said, what? What do you mean with a good backhoe? He said, I want somebody to go out and dig up and find every fiber optic cable and bust it. So they have to go back to communicating in the ether so we can collect it, because we're not very good at that. So, you learn there were problems. So I wrote a story in which I interviewed the head of the NSA. His name was Mike Hayden. He just wrote a book, and he later became head of the CIA. And the last paragraph was about him saying, I asked him if he would ever spy on Americans, because there's always that notion that there's a lot of lying that goes on in the FISA process. As you know, there's a court in which you're supposed to get a warrant, and everybody wants to think that it's the problem with the court is the judges are all Republicans. But the fact is, many of the Republicans are libertarians that care more about the Constitution than most. The fact is that the NSA, take my word for it, has been cheating. It listens before it gets a warrant to make sure the warrant's going to be approved. That happens a lot more than anybody knows. Anyway, but so here's this guy who tells me we're never going to spy, and he's spying on everybody. And here's this NSA. You saw Bill Binney, and you saw Tom Drake, who's here today. You saw this sort of incredible integrity they have in terms of knowing the power they have to violate the constitutional rights, and the care that the NSA, and even in the CIA, the good people were very careful. A lot of them did not want to go over the line. And so you have a situation where after 9/11, it's very clear, and if you read Bill Binney's stuff, and you should, his long essays and articles, the history of what happened to Binney and Wiebe and all these guys, all the guys that were that collectively objected to the immediate disavowal of everything the NSA was saying publicly about not violating the rights, the Fourth Amendment rights, the rights to, and the Fifth Amendment really too, of Americans, not eavesdropping on everybody. And so that was all thrown away. And so you had a situation where there's, about, I don't know how many, 25, 30,000 workers. I don't know how many there were in 2001, but it's now close to 30,000. And you certainly have that many contractors. But let's go down. Let's say there's 20,000 people at the NSA and 20,000 contractors, most of whom have all the clearances. It's really sort of like, once you leave the NSA, if you play the game and form a company, and you heard this was mentioned yesterday, you can, as Tom said yesterday, you could be making a great deal of money. It's sort of like a Franklin Delano Roosevelt had all these worker groups that all these projects, what we would call socialism, the Sanders idea of putting a lot of people to work, and the NSA is sort of like that. It's sort of like a post-Depression day employment agency. You can just go to work and get contracts. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, you go to work and you get a contract and you hire some people and you're dipping in. And so let's say 20,000 people, let's say 10% of them, 2,000, knew within days, because the word was out very quickly on the inside that it's all over. We're listening to everybody. We're opening up everything. It's going to be metadata. The Brits are very good because they don't use metadata. And what Binney was doing was his group was trying to do the same sort of small scale, carefully vetted listening with warrants and with the proper procedure, but instead of the broad scale stuff. Everybody knew it. And then you have contractor world, 10%, that's 4,000 people. Let's say within 2-3 months after the decision was made to start listening are listening. It's probably a lot more than that, but let's say 4,000 people. And out of this, when did Snowden go public? 2-3 years ago? Was it 3 years ago already? Was
2013.
it 13? Yeah. So out of this, this begins in 2001, 12, 13 years later, one guy goes public. One guy, and tells it. And then what happens? Nobody else says anything. And people say to me, it's paranoia to talk about conspiracies. And when you think about a conspiracy, there was at least 4,000, and I'm sure the number's a magnitude bit more, a significant percentage of the NSA. I've talked to a lot of people who have told me with great reluctance, but they're truth tellers when they retire. Of course we knew what was going on. The word was out right away. I mean, how could you not know? Nobody told us anything for 13 years till Snowden did it, and then nobody said a word in his defense afterwards. It's pretty amazing. So, when people say, some of the people who, we're in la la land when we start talking about the capability of the government to do things that are against the citizens' interests, and that once you're inside, it's very insular. I mean, and I see it more and more in the press. I think the American press, particularly in the Main Street, I worked at the New York Times, and I always never felt a constraint. We had a very conservative editor, Abe Rosenthal, he later went on to write insanely conservative columns. But when I worked there, he would, I joke all the time, he used to come to the Washington News Bureau and come up and pat me on my head. "How's my little commie today?" he would say. And then the next question was, "What do you have for me?" It's the next question that doesn't get asked anymore in the press. So when you see the shift to the right, you just see it. It's right there. It's just right there. It's right there for all of us. And we have. I'll describe the situation in Syria the way I like to describe it. Right now, what's going on in Syria basically is the United States and Russia and the Syrian army and the Iranian army and Hezbollah are fighting a war against the NATO ally, Turkey. That's what the situation is. We're basically in a war with the Kurds on our side. So we're basically at war with the government of Turkey, and particularly its crazy president, who basically wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, of the 17th and 18th century. I think that's his dream. Who knows what his dream is, but it's something. And so we're basically in a war against the NATO. It's really quite amazing, but it's never described that way. And we have, as much as I think Obama's done some things that are useful domestically, and there's a lot of things about him, just in terms of sheer brain power, for once, that's good to have a president who's pretty smart. He's just, on foreign policy, it's incapable of telling the truth to the American people. Just incapable. And so, there we are. Let's do questions.
No.
Well, here's the point.
Yeah.
Here's the point. The point is that the world is increasingly, as you see in the Trump, and even in the Hillary crowd, don't forget what she said about Gaddafi. We saw, he died. That's the line she did say about him, this insane operation that took place, 5 years ago, in Libya. The point is, that the world's increasingly being run by despots and people without character, or not as much character as they could have or should have. And so what I see, what we do in the media, wherever you are, and that's why this whole notion of this internet and this whole new sort of emerging, inchoate, far from perfect, new wave of journalism that's going to soon take over, because I think the printing press is in trouble. This whole new wave of communication, it's the job we have, and the way I like to see what we do is, it's sort of our job to be at least a filter or a moderator or a medium through which we can do something about the madness and the craziness of the people that lead the world. And we find it more and more, criminals, despots, people who personalize everything are leading the world. And so the filter is us, and that's why it's so important to be in opposition and to have counter-narrative, because certainly in my country, I think with the dumbing down of Congress because of the money, the corruption of the money, you can't run for Congress unless you have a PAC and you have all this money that Sanders is talking about. Sanders is really an amazing sort of phenomenon, and that the American press just ignores pretty much. They cover him, but it's always an anomaly when he does well. There's something going on. There's something really going on in America, and it's not going to die whether he wins or loses. It's not going to die whether Hillary wins or loses. It's not going to die. There's something going on, and who knows where it's going to end up. It could end up in violence, as we saw in Chicago yesterday. It could end up in violence. We're on that edge. So America's in a very interesting place right now, and you're not hearing about it. You're not hearing about it. There's something that makes the 30-year-olds go 80% for him. And it includes among the urban blacks, too. They're going very strong for him. Not in the South, but other places. It's just a fascinating time about what you're not being told enough about, because it's too counter-narrative. We're still focused on, what will Trump or Rubio say? And there we are. It's just like, what? What does that have to do with what's really going on? There's something really going on here that they're not seeing. They don't want to see because it's against the interest. I don't know. I don't know for what reason.
But there are other things that you've dealt with which also deal with omission. I mean, you think, for example, of Abu Ghraib.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps you could tell us a bit about the experience of having that story you said for months in advance.
Well, you mentioned that TV show. What I had I knew about it because I spent time in Damascus in December of over Christmas, I think, of 2003. What we did is after America won the war against the army that didn't fight and went to fight another day. I mean, that's another history we don't look at. Why the insurgency began is because they chose to do what happens in Afghanistan with the Brits, if you know that history. The invaders come and everybody moves away, and then eventually the war comes. In fact, I went, it's a digression, but when I went, the Iraqi army collapsed completely. And it did collapse. It just, many elements moved to the underground to begin we were not subtle about what we were going to do. And there was a lot of planning. You're not going to stand up and fight us man to man. It wouldn't work. We have too much power. So they go and they began the insurgency. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of State, when they first began to get attacks on our troops, he called them dead enders, not understanding what was going on. There was a real insurgency that went on. And I'm one of those people who think that we really, in America, we have a moral obligation to do more than we did for the people of Iraq. Not just pulling out wasn't the answer. We really owe the people of Iraq a life. And I wonder what a 5-year-old kid in 2003, 13 years later, 16 years old, if he's not psychotic, there's something wrong with him, because we've left a psychotic world there. Anyway, after the war, the first thing we did was Mossad went after the Mukhabarat, killed everybody who was in the Israeli section. We went after everybody. We turned some of the people around in the Mukhabarat into killing teams. We began assassination squads through third parties, the El Salvador model. And so whatever happened there is so completely unreported. It's sad, but anyway, we went to almost everybody a 1 and 2 star in the whether you're Sunni or Shia in the Iraqi army. We grabbed. We either killed them, or we had people kill them, or we turned them around. We neutralized them, and there was one guy we missed. It was a signals intelligence officer, Air Force, very articulate, very good English. He worked with the UN crowd. That's how I knew him, through some of the UN peacekeeping crowd. And he was in Baghdad. He had an 18-year-old daughter that was in med school, and she didn't know English, so they had to stay. There was a med school there in Baghdad, and a younger boy. And he stayed. He left eventually, but he stayed as long as he could. But he came out to Damascus. I remember it cost a lot of money for him to take a taxi to get through the lines. You could do it even then. In December of 2003, this was what 8 months or 9 months after the American invasion. And he spent 5 days with me in a hotel, telling me everything he could, including what he said, you've got to watch Abu Ghraib, he said, because the woman there, I'll never forget this. He said the women who are there are writing, when they see family or somebody leaves, they're passing the word. About the notion of the sacredness of woman there in terms of men, and very pristine, different culture. If I play tennis with somebody in Cairo, we don't shower together. Everybody showers privately. It's a different culture. we work on guilt, you could say, in the West, and they work on shame. Maybe it's very simplified, but there's a lot to it. Anyway, he said that the women there, the wives and women and daughters who are in jail, there were many in jail, are writing letters and telling their brothers and father to come and kill them because they've been dishonored by the Americans in the jail. So wow, that's another level of corruption, that all of which we don't know much about. But anyway, that got me into it. And then I could pick up stuff, and eventually what happened with CBS was I had picked up on the photographs that were around, and also on this wonderful man named Army Major General named Anthony Taguba, who was born in the Philippines and was the highest ranking member of, his father had been the Philippine Army and had saved American lives, and they after the war he became an American Army sergeant, and he raised his sons very rigorously. He went to a scholarship in Idaho, Boise State University, graduated what we call ROTC, obligated to the military, Tony. He was 5'3" and 120 pounds, and he got to be a 2-star. And by the time he was assigned to investigate the Abu Ghraib event, he was going to have a 3rd star. There was nobody that high up in a minority, in an Asian minority or a Filipino majority ever in the Army. So, he had done a report that I got my hands on. So from my point of view, this was at the New Yorker, the report was devastating. He later told me that when he was writing that report, the commanding general of the war, a general named Abu Ghraib, our headquarters was in Doha, outside of Doha. He was with his boss, and the report was pretty much done, and the boss knew about it, and one day they were in a car together, and the boss there was a driver, and he rolled up the window between the driver and he and Tony, and he said to Tony, he said, you know, Tony, if you do that report the way it's going to be, the way you've written it, he said, you will be investigated. You're going to be in real trouble. And as he told me, he said, I'd been in the Army 31 years, and it was the first time I thought, oh my God, I may be in the mafia. It's an amazing line. And so you have that sort of integrity that does exist. And I heard CBS had the photographs, and they were afraid to run them. And so what I did was, and I wanted CBS, even though my editor disagreed violently with me, I said, no, let them run the photographs first on television, and then we'll run the report. And the report, it's 60 pages of complete criminality from top to bottom. It's devastating. It'll change. And so he agreed, and week after week, CBS didn't run it. And I knew they were ready to run. I knew somebody there at 60 Minutes. And I knew that the bosses were telling Dan Rather and those people no. So I actually did call up and say to somebody at CBS high up, I did say, that's why it's in that movie, I did say, here's the situation. You guys have now had the story ready to go for 2 weeks. They were on then on Thursdays and Sundays, 60 Minutes. It was the only serious news show, even though it's less serious than it was in America. There's no news in America at all. No news. It's just hopeless. Hopeless. It's just hopeless. It's just maddening. Thank God for sports. I like TV. And so anyway, and I did say, I said, here's the story. If you don't run it the next show, I'm doing this story. You know what I have. They all knew I had this. I have a report you don't have. And the second paragraph of my story is going to describe in detail how for 3 weeks you hesitated not to run the story. So they ran it. And the thing that nobody wrote about is he said, CBS is running this show only because we know another major news organization is preparing to publish it. And so therefore we feel we have to do it as a matter of competence. That's how they began their show, excusing themselves for running it. I'm not kidding. That's the way they did it, passed unnoticed. I just thought to myself, wow, they acknowledge what cowards they are. So anyway, so there we are. We're stuck with television. Let's see, my colleagues go on television daily, hourly, on the cable news shows about politics and events. There's no more any foreign policy. Syria's off the wall, Russia's off the wall, even though we all want to hate Putin, but other than that, the world anything else is off the wall. There was an election in Iran that turned out not the way they wanted it, and then moderates won. Now, that's a non-story. You know, it's much better if the right wing had won. And now we're going after them because they fired some missiles that if they had a nuclear bomb, why, there might be a violation. But since they don't have, anyway, they have a legal right to do. The Iranians have never cheated. They've been you all know the story. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been monitoring the Iranians from day one. They issue 4 reports a year, and every year they say no sign of any diversion. They're enriching to about 3.7, enough to run a reactor, a commercial reactor for power. Guess what? In the summer, Tehran has brownouts. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. They need a lot more juice. They do have a lot of oil and gas, but they don't have a line running from the southern port where they ship it up north. They stupidly don't really they export too much of their stuff. They don't use enough of it domestically, their gas anyway. And so they have a power problem. Not unknown. Anybody knows anything about the country knows it, but these are all facts not to be told. So anyway, it's just a sitter. These stories are just sitters. But in the case of what happened is, I knew about Abu Ghraib. It maybe led me to keep on asking and get a piece of paper, but you did need a piece of paper. In America, you need a piece of paper. Snowden provided the pieces of paper. And there's a lot more where there is. I don't know why we don't see it all, but that's okay. He's certainly done enough. Der Spiegel has much more. I don't know why Der Spiegel doesn't do more, but that's their business. Spiegel's done fine on that one. I got no problem with Spiegel. Let's go do some questions.
No, I think in fact, we've got a terrible problem because we're now out of time.
Well, you should do one question to make everybody late.
All right, okay, one question.
There's a lady here.
Right, okay, over here.
I'm around.
there was a question here.
There's some people who want to talk to me, and I didn't answer them, but I'll be around afterwards. We can go do some interviews later.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
All right. Hello. Thank you very much. I'm very flattered. I'm the only question. I was wondering, you mentioned, I guess it's all linked. You were talking about what Der Spiegel is doing with what they have. You were talking about how there's this shift of the media to the right. You were talking how to bring a story to people, and I was wondering, do you think it's getting more and more difficult? Because I'm a journalist, I did a lot of interviews with former state officials, especially American ones, and it seems that everyone was telling me that right now it's becoming more and more difficult to bring about a different narrative from the old consensual narrative in the US, for example. I probably think it is getting more and more the same in Europe, but since you know the US much better than I do, I wanted to ask you what you think about this. Is it really more difficult these days to bring a different narrative, to break out a story which would go against the man? Okay. Yeah, thank you.
The way my answer to that is boo-hoo. It's never been easy. Is it more difficult, less difficult? Boo-hoo. That's your job, not to worry about it. Go get it. Okay.
Thanks, Sai. That's great.
Well, I'm ready to go.
Right.